Hello, I'm Bob the Booker. Welcome to my channel. And today I am joined by the wonderful Sam Kenyon,
Well,
author of I Am Not Raymond Wallace. I'm really delighted that Sam and I are going to be talking about the book a bit today. We've got a chance to ask him a few questions as well. So Sam, why don't you introduce yourself and introduce a little bit about this wonderful book?
thanks so much for having me, Bob. I am a writer and composer and teacher, and I live in London. And I wrote the first draft of I Am Not Raymond Wallace 20 years ago. It was based on a story that was told me by an older friend who had had an experience. He was married to a woman with children by this stage, but had had an experience of queer love and loss in the early 60s. And that story stayed with me so powerfully that it's what inspired me to then develop it into this novel, which then came because I saw a tweet by Incandescent in early 2020 asking for submissions. And I thought, you know what, it's on my hard drive, let me send it off. And this is what happened.
Yes, thank
And
you. Well, I'm
I'm
very
sorry,
glad.
it's spread across three separate time periods. So 1963, 1983, and 2003.
Super, thank you. And great that this book kind of came to be. And I mean, specifically on those time periods, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. So you've obviously set it across these three different time periods, three periods that were incredibly different for how queer people moved in the world. Why was it important for you to show those times, and how did you go about making those feel authentic?
I'm really interested in legacy and how we interact with former and subsequent generations. And I'm also interested, so that's about queerness, LGBTQ experience, and the ways in which legal structures change our experiences and freedoms. And 1967, as far as I'm concerned, should be described as the partial delegalization of homophobia, rather than the partial decriminalization of homosexuality, because for me, it's not a crime, of course. But I'm also interested in emotional inheritance and what we know or don't know that we've inherited through our parents and how we might process that. And for one character, so Raymond's son appears in the novel, and it's really about what his inheritance is and as he tries to come to terms with it and to find out more about it.
Super, thank you. And I think particularly kind of off the back of that, so often in the book, there are parts where Raymond is trying to find his tribe and trying to find where he belongs, which I thought was really well captured, and particularly how, sometimes he finds his tribe completely by accident. Sometimes he intentionally looks out for it. How did you go about writing that? What did you draw on to write that? And how, what about that was important for you?
I love how we queer people find each other, and it's so often through a glance or a shared moment with a sense of humor. And there's a certain romance in that, whatever the outcome of that event is, an understanding. And I've read loads and loads of novels and books about our history. And I just wanted to express and put down the serendipity that so often comes or it is part of those encounters. So the moment when Raymond's son Joe finds a Parisian bar, I remember walking along by the Seine, this is about 20 years ago, at night, and just thinking, oh, I'll go and look at what that doorway is, and walking up to that doorway and finding a tiny little rainbow flag sticker next to it, and then going in, and there I was in the club that he finds himself in. And so the chance, the delight of those moments, and as I say, the romance, and there's a risk as well often associated with them. So there's something so delightful when the risk disappears and it's just togetherness, whether that's sexual or just, as I say, an encounter where it's where you get a sense of mutuality.
Definitely. And I think something that I found really quite captivating within that was one of those earlier scenes where we have, without spoiling anything, Raymond walking into a sort of clothing shop, and almost this entire conversation is done through glances or through certain phrasings that Raymond doesn't initially pick up on, but sort of reflects on later. And all of these little nuances, which for me felt like such an astute observation of actually the kind of codes and ways that queer people often communicate to each other, right? That there's, and exactly like you said around safety, sometimes we don't know if we're going to be okay to transmit that message, so it has to be incredibly coded, hence things like Polari, hence so many other things where we've sort of coded these really kind of, and you almost become sort of a spy in your own kind of way, kind of decoding this.
There's something in that scene which is also about sometimes when I've had encounters like that, I felt a kind of regret that something more hasn't happened within them. And what I realized is that that's just about community. It's not that, I mean, sometimes I've regretted that something did happen within the circumstances, but it's I think the power in it lies in the acknowledgement that we are everywhere, which we know. And part of the reason to write a book historically like this, I love Sarah Waters' books, for example, to find ourselves in Victorian London, to go, yeah, of course we were there. And we weren't published. Those stories weren't published, but how do we imaginatively put ourselves where we know we definitely were, navigating the things that we had to navigate in those circumstances?
Definitely. And very much linked to that, this sense of sort of fear comes through quite strongly in the book. Obviously, the kind of the time period, particularly the early part of the book, we're talking about sort of McCarthyism kind of creeping in. Sort of later in the book, we're starting, you know, things get better, but not a great deal always necessarily. And so there is so much fear and suspicion and kind of claustrophobia that sort of suffuses, especially that early part of the book. And what was that whole process like in writing that for you?
It's very interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot, about the fear, and I was out with my friend. My friend is Murray Melvin, who was in Taste of Honey, the original Taste of Honey. He's now 90, and we were out in Camden the other night. We'd just been to see a show, and as we're walking along arm in arm, and two men who I'm going to assume are straight just went puffs, and I'm with a 90-year-old man here, and you're shaming us. And attacking us, actually. And there was it was a quiet, or you could almost miss it, but I clocked it. And it's there it's there all the time. And I suppose some personalities deal with that in different ways. And mine is to clock it, and it does affect me. And I know people for whom it doesn't affect them. But also there are different, I mean, I've been listening to the audiobook by Alex Wingfield of my book, and he's done a beautiful, beautiful job. And it made me realize just how claustrophobic it is. I don't think I'd quite understood it until I was listening to him say, I was going, oh, crikey, this is really intense. Of course it is. So I think I live with that fear as a kind of vigilance. I've been attacked, I've been spat at, I've been, you know, called names, I've been all of the above. And so I don't get to walk around without that. And so to explore it in a book, it was meaningful to render that in a way that we can discuss, for example, now. And one of the things that's come of friends of mine or relatives of mine who've read the book is that a number of them have said, I feel like I understand you better now. And of course, I'm not Raymond, as the title would tell you, but they've seen me as a result of what they know I know now in the book, which has been really moving and striking.
Well, firstly, sorry to hear that happened to you the other day. That sounds awful. But also I think I think exactly as you said, I think you've rendered that really beautifully. There were so many parts of that bit of the book, particularly that first section where, you know, both what we were talking about the sort of glances and the coded language, that really hit me, and sort of I saw myself in that. And then equally in this sense of fear and claustrophobia, I was just like, I haven't seen it always rendered in quite this way of just how much it seems to suffocate every single thing within the book. But actually then when there are these beautiful moments of release, and that leads on quite nicely to the sex scenes in this book. I think something that I found really quite beautiful about the sex scenes in this book was that they were this sort of combination of being, you know, really realistic and tender and sweet, but also kind of nervous and awkward and vulnerable. But also there was a real sense that came through of how kind of characters grew through that experience, how it meant something quite quite poignant to them. How was it for you writing those scenes, and what were the kind of intentions you had about those going in?
That was to go off at a wild tangent. When I was, and Freudians look away now, please. When I was 14, my mum gave me a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover, and I read it. And I remember my mum saying, you know, some people think it's just about sex, but I think it's a beautiful love story. And there are sequences in that where there's lots of sex in it, which is why it was banned. But what the sex does is it forms part of the narrative, as you're referring to in my book as well, and character development. So Connie's affair with Michaelis early on in the book, where he reaches orgasm before she does, it leaves us with a sense that something's missing for her in terms of a real connection. And then when we get onto the real affair between her and Mellors, it's about nudity and being human animals. Mellors says at one point, and if that shits and that pisses, I want a real woman, he says, or something along those lines. And so he loves the front and the back of her. And I found that so striking. Of course, I was turned on by all sorts of things in the book, but I was really also turned on intellectually and emotionally by that connection. And so I was thinking about that when I was writing my sex scenes. And there was one, the first one, was one that my editor Nathan really, in the first draft, which was about 3 times longer than the one that is in the published book, he just went, I don't really get what's going on here, and I'm not sure that this is right for this book and the sex scenes. And so I went, okay, I know they're right in my heart. I've got to make sure that I render them in a way that is palatable to him. And one of the things I did in editing that down was to make sure that it's as much about Raymond's realization of his own erotic imagination as it is about the actual sex. And in fact, so it's as much about going, but this isn't dirty or wrong. This doesn't, I don't know why people, you know, it's things like that. So to make sure that it's about the development of a character, and specifically, I've seen so often we're in a kind of pornified version of our own sexualities where everybody's sort of oven ready in terms of erections, and I just go, that's not been my experience. Certainly not first time. Sometimes I feel like that, but most of the time I don't. And so to render, I think we see a lot of women as naive and inexperienced sexually, and then certainly in the kind of picaresque novels we see those developments, but not often with men. So Tom Jones, for example, is pretty much oven ready from the age of 12, whereas what I wanted was to discuss something much more realistic to me. When my very first kiss with a man, my knees did buckle, and it really was as seismic a change. And I did feel, and then there's another moment when I really felt love at first sight, when I really did feel as though the chemistry of my body was changing. I couldn't understand what was happening to me. So I really, when I was writing it, those sections, the really tender sections about sex, are often the ones that have stayed in from 20 years ago. Those are me as a 29-year-old, just wanting to express that preciousness.
And I think that comes through really strongly. Again, without spoiling anything for people who haven't read it yet, I think the thing that I found particularly beautiful was, I remember listening to parts of it being read out by you for Damien Barr's Literary Salon podcast, where that kind of scene is focused in on. And the thing that struck me on hearing that the second time was exactly what you've just said, that there's a real kind of, it's entirely consistent with his character, that Raymond, who is only just, that, you know, this is all incredibly new to him, is completely overwhelmed by parts of this experience, but is also so nervous, so kind of tentative, and it really does feel like it's sort of, he's staring over an abyss. That this is, if he goes through with this, his life is irrevocably changed. And so I think I really love what you said there about how this kind of serves the narrative, that actually the sex scenes to me felt incredibly realistic in and of themselves, but also within the book. It didn't feel like some sort of cheap titillation thrown in. Not like that's necessarily a bad thing.
I love the cheap titillation, but also what's interesting about it is how different people have responded to those. So some people, a friend of my mum's wrote to her and just went, I was worried when I bought Sam's book that there was going to be too much sex in it. And she said her mother couldn't even say the word sex. She had to say sex. And her response was, but they're so beautiful and touching and meaningful, the scenes, and then they're pretty raunchy as well. So I was really excited to find this, 70-year-old woman, straight woman, going, it turns out I was totally up for reading this, and a good straight male friend of mine just said, I found it much less complicated being turned on by queer sex because it doesn't involve me, but I could. So people have been turned on to it in different ways, whether they've been moved or touched or erotically turned on. And there's a funny thing that Tom of Finland said about his drawings, which is that if I don't get hard when I'm drawing it, I know it's no good. I'll just leave that one there.
Fantastic. I mean, in the book itself, you write as well at one point in the perspective of another writer, Raymond Wallace himself. We learn sort of as we go on through the book that this first section has been written by Raymond Wallace and is sort of a standalone part of a book within a book. How was that for you, sort of getting inside the head of an author for this part?
What was lovely was that because I can now say I am an author, certainly a published one. So in a way, there's something really powerful about saying this, and this from the very first page, that this isn't a spoiler, that you're reading a book within a book. Yeah, and it's something very powerful because then that text then has a certain status. Yeah, and what I wanted to play with within the book is that then other characters read that book and engage with it, sometimes erotically, sometimes just reflectively, and to play with the kind of idea of what a text gives us, which is something that we can then discuss. And so to explore what that means to other characters who have different relationships with Raymond. Yeah. So really, then I suppose the other thing is that I think we're all always coming to terms with the decisions made by other people on our behalf, usually parents, right? And so to then be able to talk about his text because it's been published, it kind of has a definitive authority about that period in lots of different people's lives, and how unfair that is, how it actually it seems to kind of, it's slightly claustrophobic for some characters to feel that is the description that everybody knows and thinks of them. And so I wanted to explore what it was to try and free oneself from that sort of legacy, going back to the idea of legacy and emotional inheritance.
Definitely. And I think that comes through really strongly in the sense that this part, frozen in time, again, without spoiling anything, when other characters reflect on it, some of them are able to sort of say, well, that's all well and good that he wrote this, but actually here was my experience of some of these same moments, or that experience is great, but actually how does that help me now? And I thought there was something really quite interesting in having that as the sort of, because whilst reading that first bit, I kept on forgetting that I was reading a bit that was going to be a book within a book. And so when it ended, I sort of had this moment of, kind of like you said, of this sort of, now that's the definitive text, that's locked away, and that isn't going to be affected by other people in the book now, that these moments are not going to get changed or sort of relived in a different way. And I was really fascinated by how that played out, particularly for the later parts of
some people have been very angry with me about that.
In what way?
I think I don't want to spoil it, but exactly what you just said. So when something comes to an end, that it came to an end. They were very, very angry that we didn't get to carry on. And actually, that's the point. So I was thrilled, but also, I mean, really quite cross. No, sorry, they were really quite cross. It's fascinating. I was like, oh wow, it's achieved slightly more than I was expecting.
I mean, and on that note, I mean, sort of just rounding off on the book more generally, I think something that I found really interesting is, you've got this book within a book, but then you've also got a peek behind the scenes to how this book came to be, and how your book came to be in terms of the publishing of it. And then at the end, there's an email sort of included from Justin, who I've interviewed on this channel, who sort of talking about his sort of first reactions to reading the manuscript and sort of about what's going to happen next. I really loved that was included as a sort of peek behind the curtains. What was that? What was your thinking in terms of including that in the book?
Well, so another editor of mine is the head of commissioning at the RSC, and Pippa, and I showed her this email, and she said, "Oh my God, that's so beautiful! You must include that." It was actually her idea, and what is true of it is that so often you send out manuscripts or you send out pieces of your art, and people, it can be so dismissive. You get like 2 sentences in response, and I know people are busy and whatever, but it was like a love letter to my book. And so, because the book is about correspondence in certain sections as well, I thought it was such a lovely idea to hold this piece of correspondence, which was properly life-changing for me when I received that. Because, you know, as I said, I wrote this 20 years ago, and I did genuinely think I would never be a published novelist because of various things that took place within the following 10 years, where I just experienced a lot of rejection. And so this email was so meaningful to me. And the fact that he's so, I mean, you know, when people read it, he's in tears as he's writing it. He's so excited, even saying, you know, if you're still, he thinks it's going to get away from him. And so the vulnerability that this publisher shows himself in that is so rare and precious that I just thought, yeah, good idea.
Yeah. It was a lovely moment to see. It really was. But in terms of, you know, we've spoken a bit about the book, and anything more would basically be to spoil some of the parts of it. So just sort of to kind of bring us to a bit of an end here, where can people find you online, and are there any other things that you're working on at the moment?
So my website is samkenyon.com. I'm Oglethorpe on social media, and I am working on an adaptation of a memoir by a guy called Samuel Stewart about a friendship between him, Gertrude Stein, and Alice B. Toklas, called Dear Sammy. And I've got about 13 songs and a few scenes for that, so I'm working on that. And then I'm also working on an adaptation of a big old novel for the stage. And then I submitted 3 manuscripts to Justin and Nathan, Raymond Wallace being the first one that they've gone with, so we'll see if anything comes of the other 2. Yeah.
Super. No, that's fab. And just as well on the kind of theme of books, what books have you read and enjoyed recently, and sort of any books maybe as well that maybe sort of played a part in the process while you were writing I'm Not Raymond Wallace?
Well, an interesting one that did was James Baldwin's Another Country, which I hadn't read, to my shame, and I read it early on in lockdown, and there's something so extraordinary about certainly the way that ends, and what he does with the characters. It's I won't say anything more about it, but it's absolutely brilliant. Ones that I've read recently. Oh, and then there's another one. I'll tell you another one, City and the Pillar, Gore Vidal, which is so awful. I mean, it's brilliantly written, but it's bloody awful. What the toxicity and the shame in the sex there. I wanted to write against that. That was, I think, 48. So I wanted to write something that was about a little bit later in the century, but something that didn't allow that to become abusive in the sex. Certainly in mine. I've read loads. I mean, I've been so lucky with the books I've read recently, but Brit-ish by Afua Hirsch is astonishing. Swimming in the Dark, Tomasz Jedrowski. There's a wonderful book, a 40-year study of non-normative families by Susan Golombok, which is absolutely knockout and says what we all know, which is that love is what matters, and not the relationships with love are what matter, not the makeup of those relationships. The Problem with My Normal Penis, Obioma Ugoala, is astonishing. It's about the aggressivization and sexualization of Black men in Britain in Obioma's experience, and it's just stunning. And part of what's stunning about it is in the middle of all of this, which it could be a diatribe against racism and sexualization, aggressivization of this particular ethnicity, but he then owns up to a realization of his own unconscious complicity in homophobic rap culture. And so it becomes this injunction to us all to improve ourselves and to be able to own up to things that are shameful. And then Box Hill, Adam Mars Jones, which I just God, I just love it. It's so quiet and subtle, and so sort of painful, and it's so unresolved. I just it's haunting. Yeah,
one of my favorite books the year I read it. Just an absolutely beautiful book. I adore Box Hill. Yeah. I went into Gaze the Word, and at one point was sort of just asking for a recommendation. I was basically like, look, do you have something like Box Hill? I like queer, dark, messy, sexy, something like that.
And say I'm not Raymond Wallace.
I I think it was just before your book came out. It was I think they gave me it was like London Triptych. I think I got instead,
I
which I've
love
not
that.
read.
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
not read
Jonathan.
yet, but I really want to.
So I was in the London Gay Writers with Jonathan 20 years ago.
Ah,
The first versions
no
of
way.
Raymond Wallace I was reading out with him and other writers. Yeah,
Right.
I think he's amazing. And he hadn't really, I think he published that about 15 years after we first met then. Yeah, he's just, I mean, that's wonderful. Yeah.
I'm very excited for it. But yes, thank you so much for talking to me about this book. Like I mentioned, I adored reading this book. I think there was so much in it that I hadn't seen rendered in quite that way. Particularly, those really smart nuances of observations around the way people spoke to each other or communicated with each other or kind of spotted things in each other, which I just thought was phenomenal. So really, kudos to you for such a wonderful book. All the best with it, and people in the audience, please do find yourself a copy and read this. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by just sort of how much is contained within its pages. Thank you again, Sam, so much for speaking to me.
And if anyone who's watching would like to let me know what they think of it, I'm always very delighted to hear from people.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you, Sam. And thank you to everybody watching over there. Take care and see you all soon. Bye-bye.